Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something very different than usual because it's been quite a while since I last talked about a lens on my channel, and in this video we'll be talking about one of my favorite lenses. This is the RF 28 to 70mm. You've seen me using this lens throughout pretty much 90% of my photo shoot videos, and that's usually the combination with the R5, and the R6 would have the 85 1.2 RF. So yeah, this lens, to be honest, it's a very heavy lens in the beginning, but after a while you actually will get used to it. There are still pros and cons with this lens, which I'll discuss later in the video, of course, and just as usual, this video is not a review video, just my thought video on this particular lens, what I think about it based on how I use it. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon RF 28 to 70mm f2. Now this lens is kind of an interesting lens for me because when it was first announced, I personally didn't really like the lens that much because it didn't really cover any of the focal range that would be actually useful for me, because if you've watched a lot of my videos, you'll know that I find 28 a little bit not wide enough. 50mm is a super weird focal range for me because I find that 50mm, it wants to be tight but it's not tight, it wants to be wide but it's not wide. It's somewhat of a very lazy focal range for me, so that's why I really don't use a lot of 50mm. Then 70 is a bit too short for 85, so for me a lot of reasons were going against this lens, and at the time I was using the EOS R anyway, so I didn't really have any reason to go for the 28 to 70, especially when I was working with the EOS R and the 1DX Classic, because that is, well, the 1DX has my favorite Canon killer science of all time. It still does, so yeah. But when I first got the R5, I decided to, you know, explore other RF lenses, because when I got the R5, that was me saying to myself, okay, I'm gonna change from my DSLR setup, like being hybrid between DSLR and mirrorless, to a full mirrorless setup. So I got the R6, R5, and still use the RP and the original R right here. Yeah, so I decided to try this lens, and I just fell in love with the lens instantly because of the quality of the lens mainly. Also, second reason to that is, well, how many other lenses it is able to pretty much replace. And again, in this video I'll be just talking about my thoughts and my experience with this lens rather than a review of the lens, simply because there are so many reviews out there already, but I'm just going to be sharing my thoughts with you guys in case it actually might help. So just as usual, just like on pretty much most of my other my thought videos on different cameras, this video will also be divided into 3 different sections. The first one will be about the build quality, the ergonomics, the usability, and then I'll be talking about the image quality, and then I'll be giving you guys my conclusion on this particular lens. So let's first start with the build quality, the ergonomics, and the usability pretty much. So this lens, well, when you first hold it in your hand, it actually feels like a brick. It is kind of heavy, but it does take like maybe 2 or 3 days to get used to the weight, and you know, by then you'll just be used to the weight, and you can actually just carry around like a normal lens. But the funny part is, once you get used to the weight of this lens, if you're holding any other lenses, let's say the 50 1.2 here, it does feel a little bit like a toy, and it does feel a little bit light. Same thing with the 15 to 35, which I actually rarely use after you know, switching to the 28 to 70mm, which is kind of funny because they're both different focal range. Before I actually started using this range, my normal standard zoom was actually the 15 to 35 f2.8, or if it was the DSLR days, I would be using the 16 to 35 f4 LIS USM. So yeah, anyway, back to this lens. This lens, it's obviously starting at f2, so that's why it's actually a bit heavier, and also the filter thread is 95mm filter thread. Now I personally don't use UV filter. This is just a normal transparent filter just to protect the lens, but it's not a cheap one. It's the B+W F Pro lens, obviously made in Germany. So yeah, if you're gonna put a filter on there, just make sure to put a really nice transparent filter, otherwise you're also just gonna be decreasing the quality in front of the element itself. So yeah, there's that. And, oh, and the hood is also really massive. You can actually use it as a bracelet pretty much. Yeah. Anyway, but without the hood, this is pretty much the lens profile, which is pretty much almost the size of my head. So yeah, that's actually quite nice to know in case you need to hit a burglar in the head with it. Anyway, jokes aside, this lens actually zooms really smoothly and there's no lens creeping at whatsoever, but there's also a locking mechanism, which is great because you guys know that I actually like to lock the camera on the side strap with the Peak Design clip, the camera clip from Peak Design. So yeah, having the locking mechanism here is actually quite nice because if you start running, if you walk fast, or if you need to catch like your bus or your ferry to somewhere and you need to run, then you know, having it protected and lock, you know, as you run, then it's actually kind of like a nice peace of mind to have. So yeah, there is that. Otherwise, I really don't like that it's zooming externally. For some reason, I feel very insecure about it, but that's probably just me. Otherwise, yeah, it's a very normal design lens, apart from the size of it. And of course, depending on the camera that you mount this lens with, you might end up actually putting the camera above the surface, because if you can see with this particular EOS R, of course there's this tripod plate from Peak Design that is kind of like leveling off with the thickest part of this lens. But if you're using something like the Canon EOS R or the Canon EOS RP especially, where the camera is extra small, you will definitely feel a huge imbalance with the setup, so just be careful of that. And to some tripod it might not be so much compatible with, but of course with most photography tripod it will be compatible with, since the plate on photography tripods are usually very small compared to video tripod plates. So yeah, just to keep that in mind, of course. Then moving on to the next point, which is obviously this control ring. It was one of the highlights when Canon first announced the R system, because this was actually one of the first lenses they announced with the R system. And to be honest, I don't use the control ring at all. There are definitely more than enough dials for me to control everything. To be honest, all these dials at the back, they definitely allow me to operate much faster than the dial up here. I do set this dial to the exposure compensation because I love to shoot in aperture priority. I find myself always shooting in aperture priority, especially in conditions where it's usually unexpected in terms of the lighting environment, things like that. And I can actually just set to the aperture that I want, because I mainly just shoot portrait anyway, which is going to be usually at f2 or f1.2 if I'm using the 85 1.2. That way I can just quickly like adjust the exposure compensation. But then again, I just, you know, end up adjusting on one of these wheels here anyway. So to me, having this is a nice feature, but it's also kind of a useless feature for me. I'd rather have the touch pad back from the EOS R, to believe it or not. But yeah, that's just my opinion on that. And now moving on to the next point, which is somewhat negative, is, well, I wish that this lens would actually have IS. I understand why they didn't fit IS in, but to be honest, this is a focal length where it's more of a versatile focal length, and having IS would actually make this lens much more versatile. Of course, there are cameras like the R6, R6 Mark II, R5, R3, and so on and so forth that actually has in-body image stabilization, but in the same time, it only helps so much. And if you're working, let's say, after sunset or before sunrise, having that extra bit of IS will actually keep the image a lot more steady actually, especially if you're shooting with cameras, let's say the R5, where the megapixel count is actually pretty high, or even cameras like the EOS R right here, where the megapixel count is decently high, but because it doesn't have the IBIS, it would help a lot to actually eliminate a lot of those blurry shots. So yeah, I just wish that it would have IS, but of course that would probably mean it's going to be easier to break, and also it's going to be a lot more expensive than what it is right now, especially after the inflation. This lens definitely increased in the price quite a bit. I got it during COVID, so it definitely increased quite a bit from when it was first announced, but not to you know, as much as if you were to buy it today. So it's somewhat in between that. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the somewhat negative points. Otherwise, I really love how well weather sealed this lens is. I know I talked about the build quality earlier, that it's very tough, very rugged, but another point, you know, of getting this lens is how well weather sealed it is. So I've taken this lens through a lot of heat waves, through a lot of dust storms, through beach shoots, through really heavy downpour situations. So yeah, it really survived it all. There was actually once when I took it to the beach and I spent like quite a few hours at the beach, and the sand I think got into the zoom ring a little bit, and it was causing a little bit of the squeaking sound. But after like shaking it off for like half a minute or so, the lens was actually functioning normal again. So yeah, that was that. That was the only time when I actually felt any concerns to the lens, because it's a very expensive lens. But otherwise, it really survived through the heat waves and also through the downpour really well. Just be careful if you're shooting a lot at beaches or places where there are a lot of sand. So yeah, there's that. Otherwise, now onto the image quality. The image quality out of this lens is great. F2 is actually quite sharp from corner to corner and also from center to corner as well. Of course, it won't be as sharp as, let's say, prime lenses shooting at F2. But it's also not that far either. It's just pretty much a hair away. That being said, if you want really sharp images out of this lens, then especially if you know you're like a travel photographer, or if you're a landscape photographer, cityscape photographer, although I would imagine so many other lenses for those disciplinary field of photography. But if you use this lens for those environments or those situations, then f5.6 onwards would be really sharp. Otherwise, f2 on here is still very sharp, from 28 all the way to 70 millimeter, and also from the center to corner as well. There's a little bit of barrel distortion, but it's nothing that you cannot fix in post. But it's also just very minor, at least for how I shoot, because I mainly just shoot portrait. Very little amount of times do I actually shoot cityscape with this lens. That would actually have to be my 15 to 35 or even the 16 millimeter pancake STM RF lens. But otherwise, yeah, most of the time I'm just shooting portraits with this, and the rendition on the details is actually really nice. The color reproduction out of this lens is really nice. It actually blows the 35 millimeter f1.4 out of the water when it comes to the sharpness at f2, and also when it comes to the chromatic aberration control, simply because the f1.4 from the 35 millimeter L lens, that one definitely has way more chromatic aberration, not only at f1.4 but actually also at f2. So I find myself replacing that lens with this lens a lot of times as well. And I'm also slowly replacing, actually not slowly, actually quite often I replace this lens with my 50-1.2. So a lot of times if I just want to travel light, I leave the 50-1.2 at home. Or in the hotel room, and just bring this lens as well as the 85-1.2 with me, and that would be, those two lenses would be my my main portrait shooting lenses, because they render everything so well, and this covers the 50 millimeter focal range anyway. And if I need to reach a little bit further than 50, or just kind of wider than 50, then this lens would also cover it. And f2, you can kind of play with the distance a little bit to get that really nice blurry background. And talking about blurry background, the bokeh on this lens is actually very nice. It's very creamy, the rendition is really nice, and also the sharp areas is also really sharp, especially when you're shooting portraits. It's so sharp, but not too sharp that you just become too distracted by the details, like the flaws on the model skin, things like that. So if you're shooting a lot with, for example, the 135 millimeter L lens, you'll know how sharp that lens is. And if you're shooting a lot of portraits, that can actually be very annoying because of how sharp that is. It just brings out all the flaws in the skin, and you have to spend a long time getting rid of those flaws. Whereas this one, it's so sharp, but it's not sharp to the point where it pulls out all the flaws of the skin, details, things like that. And Yeah, I really love it. Again, the color rendition is great and the detail rendition is also great out of this lens. I just have no complaints towards the glass at whatsoever. The chromatic aberration is also pretty good, whether you have the chromatic aberration control turned on or not in camera. It still controls it very, very nicely. And yeah, the only other complaint I would have about this lens would actually be the focus breathing. The focus breathing on this lens is actually quite pronounced, especially if you're shooting at 28mm focal range. You will actually see when focusing between the near object and the further object how the focus breathing really pulls in and out in the image, and you feel like you're really losing quite a bit of focal range depending on where your subject is actually located in the image. Apart from that complaint, there's nothing else really to complain about. Oh, and if I can just go back to the ergonomics and the build quality and the operational side of things a little bit, just to touch on the autofocusing system. The autofocusing system on this lens is great. It's very fast and it's also very accurate. Just because it's a huge glass and it's a lot of glass to travel through doesn't mean that the autofocusing system will be slow. It's actually quite snappy, quite fast as well. And it goes even faster on the R5, R6, as well as on the R3. So that is something to be really impressive about, well, really impressed about. And now back to the image quality. The last point that I would like to touch on is the sun-star effect. So if you're like me and if you really like proper sun-star effect, this lens is really good for that, because it can actually renders the sun-star effect quite nicely, and it also is quite elegantly rendered as well. Not only the sun-star effect is really nice, like with the rendition and everything, but the flaring when you shoot into the sunlight is also really nicely controlled. It looks so nice. It's there, the flaring, but it's so nice and soft, and also it's very pleasant to look at. And it's not distracting like some cheaper lenses would, or some other expensive lenses actually renders them. So for example, with my Fuji lenses or with my Sony lenses, even like most of the Fuji and Sony lenses, they have very, very ugly sun flare and sun star effect. Whereas with the Canon and Nikon lenses, especially the pro level lenses, they mostly have very nice rendition in terms of like the flaring and also the sun star effect, and this one is no exception. It's actually very, very nice and elegant coming out of this lens. And there's very little amount of ghosting as well when shooting against the sunlight as well, and there's still very, very good contrast control when you shoot against the sunlight or any bright light source in that matter. So yeah, it's very positive so far, and yeah, I don't really have any negative points about this lens, just apart from the fact that I wish that it would be more internal zoom, even though it would require it to be a bit bigger. But otherwise, yeah, no complaints towards this lens. And now into my conclusion. I know it's been a really weird video so far, because usually I would have a lot of things to complain about and also a lot of things to balance it off in terms of the pros side of things. But you know, I've been talking about this lens as if, you know, I'm sponsored by Canon, but I'm not. It's a really good lens, and to be honest, it replaced, yeah, my 50-1.2, my 35 f1.4 lens whenever I'm traveling. And to be honest, despite how heavy this lens is, yes, you can get used to it, but like replacing those two lenses just makes my bag a lot lighter by just using this lens. And to be honest, if I only just can use this one lens without changing to either of the other two lenses, it will also save me a lot of time while shooting on the field, or at least eliminate the need to bring a third body with me, because I hate changing lenses on the field. So that is a huge advantage for me to bring this lens as well. And I feel like if you're on the fence of getting this lens or not, actually try it in the shop, because you know that I would actually highly recommend this lens if you can actually justify the price for it for what you shoot, of course, because it actually doesn't fit into all of the areas of photography that is out there. But on the other hand, this lens is also replacing my 15-35mm f2.8 as well. Of course, they're just both two completely different focal ranges, but in the same time, when I'm just doing a lot of travel photography, replacing or having one lens instead of three other lenses in my bag, this is just pretty much much a nice compromise to go for. And of course, in the same time, having that benefit of the image quality and also that f2 rather than f2.8 on the 15 to 35. Of course, I'm not going to be missing out a lot on the f1.2 of the 50mm or on the f1.4 of the 35mm, because a lot of times I actually can work with the actual focal range, or actually the distance between the subject and me, to get extra blurry background. So if I actually need that blurry background, of course there will be situations where only the 51.2 can achieve certain look that I want, or the 35 1.4 can achieve that look that I want. But in most cases, this will be able to fill the gap between the for the 35 and the 50 while traveling. So that is why it's worth it for me, because obviously when traveling, it's also it's really good to carry less weight on you, and having this equals much less weight on me than usual. And of course, it's nice to just always have one lens attached to the body rather than always changing lenses. And this would be definitely the go-to lens, because I can just change between street shooting to landscape shooting, landscape to cityscape, cityscape to just portrait shoot within just one lens, as well as, if I have to do some simple product photography or food photography, I can actually just switch into that right away. The f2 really helps out a lot, and it's really sharp from f2 all the way to f14 even. I would say around f2 all the way to f14 it's really sharp. And if you really want the sharpest point, it's between f5.6 to around f9 in my experience and also in my opinion. Apart from that, as mentioned a bit earlier, this lens is actually a really nice and well built lens with a really nice weather sealing to it. It's really tough and rugged, and yeah, it just makes this lens extra versatile when you travel or when you do your work, and you can actually really rely on it. So yeah, that's it for this video. Usually I have a lot more to say, but for some reason in this video it's quite straightforward. It's a pretty good lens with very minimal amount of drawbacks, and yeah, I would actually really highly recommend it. Is it expensive? Yes, it is. Is it worth it? It depends on the field of photography that you do, but for what I do, it's more than worth it. For the quality that I get, for the versatility, and for the speed that I can work with just with this lens alone, it saved me a lot of time. It allowed me to deliver more quality results to my client, but also to myself as well. So yeah, and it actually got me a lot of nice portfolio shots as well. So yeah, it's not just a standard normal zoom lens, but it's also a standard normal zoom lens that actually deliver really great results as well. So that is something that I really like. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it really only takes you a few days to really get used to the size of this lens. Just clipping it on you or having it around you, it just became the one lens setup for me in general. It's so weird. It has pretty much the combination of the focal range that I really hate, but in the same time, because of the quality of the glass, the build quality, the versatility of the lens design and everything makes it so nice. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it was both a wrong decision to try it out and also a right decision to try it out that day when I decided to get the R5, because yeah, I just came home with the R5 and the 28 to 70mm f2. Whew. But yeah, otherwise that's it for this video. If you have any questions, anything to share, feel free to actually comment down in the comment section down below. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free. It's for beginners. It's on my website. The link is also down in the description section below as well. As I'm slowly losing my voice because the summer heat. Yeah, otherwise I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.